All right, welcome back. So we're going to continue with chapter 25. And so nitrogen, we're still talking about nitrogen, and it is being deposited globally in this reactive form, both wet and dry deposition of nitrogen, often associated with pollution. So with burning of fossil fuels, with industry, agriculture, and some just in dust. There's nitrogen in dust. And so what you can see is these dramatic shifts between 1860 and the 1990s and now what's predicted for 2050 in terms of reactive nitrogen deposition. And so this is basically fertilizer coming from the sky. It's fertilizing all kinds of ecosystems and environments, deserts, grasslands, forests, and it's problematic. And so it's definitely something that global climate change scientists are focusing on, this nitrogen deposition and changes to it. So here's a really recent example. These are pollution images from Wuhan, China in just January of 2019 compared to January of 2020 during the COVID-19 outbreak. What you can see is a dramatic decrease in O2 pollution just because of social distancing efforts and shutting down large cities during the outbreak of this virus. So that is an unintended, somewhat positive consequence of this outbreak. So when systems get too much nitrogen, we call them eutrophied. So a lot of eutrophied systems are aquatic. They tend to get the brunt of this kind of pollution, and you often find eutrophication at the deltas of rivers. So where rivers are bringing that nitrogen out into the ocean, you get this pulse of fertilization in coastal ecosystems. You can also see, this is an example of what's called the dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi River. So you can see how large the Mississippi drainage is. How much of that is agricultural land? A lot. And how much of it is receiving fertilizers? So all of those river systems are draining into this one location at the coast of Louisiana in basically the estuary that is where the Mississippi pours out into the ocean. And it's created this massive dead zone because of all of this eutrophication pollution. And yeah, it's really not a pretty sight. There's similar pollution that influences inland bodies of water, like Lake Washington. So Lake Washington is a lake just north of here. It was historically oligotrophic, meaning very limited resource inputs. And it's called a monomictic lake. So it basically mixes once a year. It's stratified in the summer when there's warm water on the surface heated by the sun and kind of puts a cap on it and keeps it from mixing, but then it mixes in the fall, basically. And it doesn't ice over, so it's not a twice mixing lake like a lot of lakes are. So until 1963, it was receiving sewage inputs from all around the lake. And that sewage was causing problems with eutrophication. And there was excess phosphorus buried in the sediments. And so in this case, it wasn't necessarily as much nitrogen as phosphorus that was causing algal blooms in Lake Washington. Here you can see changes in phosphorus loading over time. And in the top, this upper left-hand graph here, we can see that in 1963, there were changes to policies around the lake, mainly the lack of phosphorus-based soaps and the lack of sewage inputs. And so we can see that phosphorus started to drop in the lake. And at the same time, we see this nice drop in chlorophyll A, which is a measure of algal biomass. And although there's these spikes, we see kind of a downward trend in cyanobacteria, which are nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And all of those things together led to increases in clarity. So this is kind of Lincoln's brown here. It's kind of the poopy period where there were sewage inputs to Lake Washington. And then in 1963, they stopped those inputs. And you can see that the water depth, the depth at which you could see this disk that you float down into the water column called a Secchi disk is increasing. So you have really cloudy, yucky water here, and then the water gets clearer and clearer and bluer through time. So the phosphorus cycle is much simpler. So here you can see that there are big pools of phosphorus, again, in the sediments, but there's not a pool of phosphorus that's very large at all in the atmosphere. It's basically just dust, and it's a very small pool, and there's a little tiny bit of flux of dust going up into the atmosphere and a little tiny flux of dust coming down. However, we do see a lot of phosphorus coming out of land and this transport in rivers. Here you can see this is a pretty big flux. And you have fluxes of phosphorus going between vegetation and the soils and between fertilizers and crops. And then we mine some phosphorus out of the ground. And there are these pretty interesting fluxes of phosphorus in the ocean as well. Now we'll just talk briefly about the carbon cycle. I feel like most of you have probably had this in other classes, but this is just a similar graph showing the carbon cycle, showing the pools of carbon. There's some carbon in the atmosphere. There's a lot of carbon in soils and benthic sediments and in deep ocean waters, and a lot of carbon locked up in rocks, mainly in limestone type rocks. And then the fluxes of carbon are mainly respiration from terrestrial and aquatic organisms and uptake of carbon from the atmosphere by plants. So that's this GPP, gross primary productivity. And we'll spend more time talking about that in further lectures. Land use change is a flux along with fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are the single largest flux from the ground up into the atmosphere, basically. And what's interesting about this is that the flux for fossil fuels seems pretty small here, 9.5 compared to 120 for all the respiration on Earth, on land. And that's true, but it's still measurable and it's still a large influence. And so we can both influence the carbon cycle by reducing our fossil fuel inputs, but also by changing this, by increasing the carbon sequestration by plants and by slowing down respiration if we can, by not say burning slash after logging, things like that. So here are some carbon dioxide concentrations through time, going back 800,000 years ago, and you can see there are fluctuations over time. What I don't love about this figure is it doesn't include today's values. So we would be way up here at 413 parts per million as of today. So this is a very, it's a graph that's not very truthful. It's not helping us to see this problem that we're at with global carbon dioxide concentrations. And those carbon dioxide concentrations, along with other greenhouse gases and really important gases like methane and nitrogen dioxide, are all increasing global temperatures. So we've been measuring temperatures globally since about 1880, and 10 of the hottest years on record have happened since 2009, since 2005. It's not all 10 of the hottest years, but the last 5 years have been the hottest 5 years. So if you look down here at the bottom, 2015, 16, 17, 18, and 19 are the hottest years on record, and they're the last 5 years that we've had in our record. So you can see this temperature anomaly. We are going up. We have been seeing hotter and hotter temperatures recorded globally over time. And so coming back to that kind of how can we change this? One of the aspects of the global carbon cycle that sees a lot less, kind of gets less press is our understanding of decomposition and how decomposition is pushing CO2 off into the atmosphere. And if we can slow decomposition down, then we might be able to kind of fix some of our global carbon problems. So decomposition the decomposition rates of things are influenced by the environment. So warmer temperatures, more moisture, increase decomposition. They're also influenced by microbes and detritivores. So these microbes under warmer temperatures tend to have higher activities. You can change the composition of both microbial and detritivore communities under various environmental conditions. And all of these things influence the decomposition rate. However, there's also information about what type of organic material is decomposing. So some information about the litter quality, how much lignin is there compared to nitrogen or phosphorus or cellulose. Some of these harder to break down molecules like lignin and cellulose slow down decomposition. Nitrogen and phosphorus tend to speed it up. Phenolic compounds like condensed tannins can also slow down decomposition. So decomposition is influenced by a variety of factors. Things like different types of tree species will decompose at different rates. Genetic differences within plants can influence decomposition. And then there's these really cool interactions between the environment and genetics, which is pretty much where I've spent the bulk of my research career has been focused on decomposition rates and interactions between genetics and the environment. So I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. And then finally, kind of how are we understanding these global systems? How are we getting these values? A lot of research has been coming from remote sensing, so satellite data and measurements of fluxes, things like NDVI. We can look at CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere over periods of time. And we can make on-the-ground measurements in what are called long-term ecological research locations. So the National Science Foundation has been funding long-term research at all of these locations in the United States, plus a host of international sites for about the last 35 years. And a lot of the work that we build upon to understand these ecosystem level processes comes from long-term ecological research sites. And then lastly, NEON. So NEON is a new series of observation locations. It's part of this National Ecological Observation Network. It's what we built our Evergreen Ecological Observation Network off of this model to some degree. But then the NEON sites are very technically advanced, using things like eddy coflex towers and like constant measurements of stream water quality, and a lot of really cool technology has been deployed across all of these sites in the NEON network. So that's where we'll be hopefully grabbing some data to do some analysis as we learn more about global ecology. All right, thanks for listening.